On behalf of Dialogue with Islam, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shahina Ali. I'm the director of Dialogue with Islam. We've been approximately running for 10 years. We're a small grassroots organisation. We get no funding. None of our speakers are actually paid. They come on a voluntary basis because they believe in our aims and objectives. And our aims are actually three things. One, to create a bridge of understanding between the Western world and the Muslim community. To try and create dialogue, discussion. There's basically very emotional feelings on both sides. Particularly the Western community has a fear of the Muslim community. And also there's a lot of grievances that are faced with or carried by the Muslim community. So we want to try and bridge that gap, try and air those discussions. Our second objective is to try and encourage an etiquette of dialogue, an etiquette of debate. With these debates, with differences, with different points of view, we need to kind of have a sense of manners of how to approach these differences, and also maybe to come across innovative ways of actually come to some kind of agreement. And where we agree to disagree, that's fine. So that brings us to our final aim, and that is to try and encourage the Muslim community to try and, as well as working with the non-Muslim community, try and come up with innovative ways of solving some of the challenges we face today. I think we've been very successful the last 10 years. If you can look at our website, www.dialogueofislam.com, you see some of the feedback of our previous speakers, which have included former Chancellor of the Exchequer, former foreign secretaries, the former director of intelligence of the US, and former editors of newspapers, and all have given very high praised feedback on our events. That's all I want to say about Dialogue Islam. If you have any comments or queries, please come and see me at the end, or alternatively visit our website, www.dialogueofislam.com. So let me move on to tonight's event. Our topic of discussion is Islam, the future of Islam in the West, and I felt I left it as a kind of open-ended discussion because it's just there's many issues and many areas that we face, particularly with the Charles Hebdo affair. We have radicalisation of the young Muslim youth. We have British Trojan inquiry. We have a number of Muslims in jail. I think it's hit all-time high, with 1 in 5 of those in top security prisons being Muslim. And today, obviously, seeing a front newspaper where you have a murderous video fronted by a London terrorist on every single paper. So this is a grim list, which to form a backdrop to tonight's discussion. And I'm delighted that we've got a distinguished panel. It gives me great pleasure to introduce 4 highly praised and suitable background. If I start off with my, on the far left here, I've got Tim Vince. Tim Vince has been involved in the leadership of Christian charities since the 1990s. He's led numerous pilgrimages to Israel, Jordan and Egypt, and edited a church newspaper on the Middle East from 1999 to 2003, covering the peace process, the Second Palestinian Intifada, and lead up to the Iraq War. He's a staunch defender of Christian freedoms and traditional values. He played a leading role in the early development of Christian TV in the UK and has presented a UK-based Christian TV programme since 2004. On my left, I have Professor Mustaqim Blair. Mustaqim Blair is a German journalist who converted to Islam in 1990. His latest 1980, sorry. His latest book, Surrendering Islam, provides a historic analysis of attempts of subverting Islam from within for political reasons. Professor Mustaqim Blair was a founder member and General Secretary of the Islamic Party of Britain. He holds a PhD in applied linguistics. He has written numerous pamphlets and booklets on various topics related to Islam. Most recently, he has completed his own plain English translation of the Quran, which is currently on the proofreading stage. Next to me on my right, I have Jamal Harwood, who specialises in Islamic economics. He currently lectures on finance on the MBA programme and has 25 years of experience working in the financial sector, including JP Morgan and banks such as Credit Suisse. He is the editor of various publications addressing Islamic solutions to the global financial crisis. Amongst others, he has engaged in public debates with the former Chancellor of Norman Lamont, Attorney General Dominic Grieve, Peter Rodman, the former US Assistant Secretary of Defense, and finally, he was a subject of a Time magazine feature in 2006. And finally, on my far right, I have Dr. Sean Gabb. He's the Director of Liberty Alliance, which is an educational charity. He's the Libertarian Alliance. He's author of 20 books and about 300 essays. These have been translated into Spanish, Italian, Greek, Slovak, Hungarian, Chinese, and Indonesian. In 1998, he gained a PhD in political and intellectual history from the University of Middlesex. And in 1991 to 1992, he was the economic and political advisor to the then Prime Minister of Slovakia. So tonight's format will be that each person will have approximately 5 minutes to give their opening remarks on the topic, after which time we'll open the floor to approximately 45 minutes of Q&A, and we'll talk about the etiquettes of that and the format of that when we get to there. And then finally, after that, it'll be the dinner time with a dinner buffet, which I'll hand you over to our advisor to organise that. So can I ask Dr. Sean Gabb first to speak for 5 minutes?
The topic of tonight's discussion, ladies and gentlemen, is the future of Islam and the West. And I must confess that 5 minutes or 6 or even 7 or 8 or 20 minutes will not be enough for me to do full justice to that topic. And so I will narrow my comments, the chairman permitting, to the topic of the future of Islam and the UK. As I look at my fellow citizens of the Islamic faith in this country, I see much enterprise and much intelligence and much admirable achievement. At the same time, I have been consistently disappointed by the nature of your dealings with the British state. You, your parents, your grandparents, whatever, were allowed to settle in this country for a number of reasons. One of the most important reasons, I think, is that the ruling class of this country does not wish to be fully accountable to the people of this country. Show me a nation homogeneous in blood, in religion, in a shared history, whatever denominator you care to choose. Show me 10 such nations, and I will show you 7, 8, or even 9 liberal democracies in which there is a high degree of equality before the law, and in which the authorities are accountable to the people. But the British ruling class does not wish to govern a nation state. It wishes to rule an empire. An empire, the subject nationalities of which are usually more suspicious of each other than they are of the state. And that, I'm afraid, is where we are today. And I will emphasize that we are today where we are. That there is no point in regretting what may have happened in the past and what may have been prevented in the past. We are where we are. And it would be useful if all of us, if all of the various groups of communities within this country were able to come together and to find some basis for the mutual toleration of our differences, and to find some basis for a common presentation of our common interests as we decide them to be. And this brings me back to my opening comment, that I am disappointed by the nature of your dealings with the British state. I do not pretend for one moment that Muslims in this country are a privileged group. You are suspected. You are demonized. You are spied on. There are plans to interfere in how you bring up your children. Your ministers of religion are supervised in ways unknown in this country for centuries. They can be deported. They can be sent off to face long prison spells in foreign countries. You are spied on. You are persecuted. If you step out of line in what you say or in what you do, you risk being sent to prison. And your response to this. You complain about it. You say that you are persecuted. But you do not base your complaints about your position on any universal principle of freedom of speech and freedom of association. No, indeed. When laws were made in this country criminalizing what the natives cared to say about you, you welcomed those laws. You would like, in many respects, there to be stronger laws against the mockery of your faith, and you would probably welcome laws to shut down political parties that do not welcome your presence here. Very bad idea. If you want to complain effectively about what is being done to you, you should start to demand your right to freedom of speech and freedom of association. And at the same time, you should demand those rights for everybody else in this country. Anything other than a universal claim will get you nowhere. And that is all I have to say. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening to you all. Very pleased to have the opportunity to speak tonight, and as Sean mentioned, a very broad subject, and I'm sure in the Q&A that we'll have an opportunity to examine many points. I'll open by saying it's very difficult today to ignore Islam in the West. As Shahinoor mentioned, frequently we will have a situation of front-page news across all of the main newspapers dealing with some, aspect of Islam, which is, 90% plus negative. And this sort of demonization, which Sean mentioned, is actually got to a very pervasive level now. In recent weeks, the Trojan horse crisis, or so-called crisis, when you look beneath the surface, it wasn't quite as bad as everyone was pointing out. The Charlie Hebdo fiasco, the counterterrorism and security bill, the radicalization of young people, these three sisters going to Syria, the most recent example, and of course, the Jihadi John scenario. I mean, this is not untypical of the media and the politicians. So it's very difficult to get any perspective on Islam and what Islam may well mean or what Islam offers to this society. So let me tackle these points head on. What does Islam have to offer? Rather ironically, over the Charlie Hebdo matter, we actually have a very powerful message, which is that it's not a question of we want blasphemy laws to be applied, or we want everyone not to criticize Islam or to criticize Muhammad, may peace be upon him. No, what we want to recognize is that free speech has certain limits. And that do we want to have a society in which free speech is not used to account politicians, but is now being used to demonize and to insult, and in this regard, to insult somebody who has passed away, of one of the greatest religions in the world. As the Pope mentioned, this free speech should not be there in terms of the attacks, core attacks upon the beliefs that people have. And again, this is something that Islam teaches, that you cannot, some things are very sacred, you cannot use free speech to attack that. You need to use it for accountability purposes. I mean, the counterterrorism and security bill, rather ironically, in this year in which they will be celebrating 800 years of Magna Carta, they are reining back on the core principles that not only Magna Carta had, but 1400 years ago Islam gave us. the importance of the rule of law, the importance of being innocent until proven guilty, the forbiddance of torture, rendition, secret courts, due process, and maybe most importantly, the question of criminalizing thought. You know, the notion of being a non-violent extremist, how broad, how obscene this new idea is, and that this will be criminalized to be a non-violent extremist on some idea, some theory, that would lead you to radicalize others, and that those people would then become terrorists. The academics have said that this is nonsense, and it is errant nonsense just by looking at the numbers and looking at the realities of terrorism. So these are just two examples where we need to turn the argument around and actually say, what does Islam have to say about these matters? Because all of those matters, the rule of law, due process, innocent until guilty, and so on and so forth, prohibitions on torture, what have you, all of those come from Islamic roots. I will end by talking about some of the positives that I think people need to look at in terms of what Islam and Muslims have to offer. You know, I talked about this respect for other beliefs, respect for civility to others, and in terms of what they hold dear to themselves. Strong adherence to the rule of law. You will find that Muslims, by and large, they have a concern for the Day of Judgment. They have a concern for the hereafter. So naturally, they are stringent in terms of their respect for others and respect for the rule of law. A very giving society, typically very high in terms of the charitable ranks in terms of giving charity, not only here but throughout the West. Very family-oriented. The very bedrock of society is within the Muslim household. And also a topic dear to my heart, some very interesting economic solutions. You know, forbiddance of usury, the excesses that these bankers, which we seem to be in thrall of, gold-silver standard in terms of the basics, and very radical taxation solutions which are based upon wealth and not based upon income, and consumption taxes. And this is why we had a very flourishing Islamic society over many centuries. Sadly, we don't have today, but it is worth Muslims and non-Muslims studying these periods of history to see exactly what Islam has to offer here in Britain and indeed throughout the Western world. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah. The future of Islam in the West. Firstly, the future will happen whether we shape it or we don't shape it. So it's a little bit up to us. Likewise, we are in the West. We're not going anywhere. We are here to stay. And if you tell Muslims today to go back home, you find them ending up in London, Luton, and Bradford. So there are some givens that we can't change. So if we talk about these matters, I think we have to consider how we talk about it. And I'm a linguist, and I deal with semantics and terminology. And this sometimes lets us down. If we're not clear about the terms that we apply and what we're talking about, we get confused about the concepts. And then, of course, those concepts get dictated to us by people who don't always have our best interest at heart. It's very nice to talk about freedom of speech. I can talk all day in my living room, but nobody will hear me. Have I got access to the media? Can I afford publishing my views? There is more to freedom of speech than the question whether I like what somebody says or what somebody does not say. 1987, a Palestinian cartoonist was gunned down where? In London. Were there protest march, solidarity marches for freedom of speech? No, we had Salman Rushdie to worry about. This is so different from Charlie Hebdo, isn't it? Because certain events we bring to the fore. Other events, we ignore them. We talk about Muslim terror. Do we talk about Israeli state terror? We do not. Certainly not in the media, but it is real, just as real. So we have to figure out how we're going to change that discourse that seems to be tilted such that a clear discussion of how we want to shape the future as citizens, whichever our belonging may be, is no longer permitted. And when we talk about these issues, coming back to Islam and the West, there are different paradigms. We can look at the old clash of civilizations, which is currently continuously being pushed down our throats. People want conflict because there are people, arms dealers, for example, finance corporations, there are people who benefit from conflict. If you create conflict, you can come in and sort it out and help yourself in the process. You could also look at a Western Islam. There are people who promote and say, well, if the Muslims become a little bit more Western, we have no problem with them. And this whole idea of moderate Islam is Islam that does away with its principles. You could look at an Islamic West, which many on the Muslim side promote and say, well, if the West becomes a little bit more Islamic, we deal with all their problems, because they got many of those, even if they don't want to admit them. So there are different paradigms. What we need to look at is who's got the best solution and who is willing to implement them. And there, of course, we have, in my view, as Muslims, an advantage, because Islam, we both, Muslims and non-Muslims, have problems. We both also have problems in not being true to our own proclamations, to our own beliefs, and falling short of our own standards. But Islam has been adaptable over the ages, but maintained a core of principles that were unchangeable because it is divine law. On the other hand, Western liberalism has a lot of baggage, historical baggage, because of the conflict with the church that it just can't get away from. And so it becomes contradictory. It wants to be liberal, but is illiberal in applying liberal principles. It becomes dogmatic. It becomes irrational. We need to deal with these issues and find a way forward of being honest with each other, rather than trying to present the other side as bad and the own side as good, as has always been the case, and then getting nowhere. So when we discuss this today and when the questions are being asked, that is what I hope we can do. Honestly assess the situation of where do we go to together, because we will be in this country and in the wider world together. We will not be separate. We will not be differentiated. We will not be having our little enclaves. And so we need to make something of it, because the planet that we live on also has demands on us, and we can't afford squabbling the way we have done in the past, and we need to take power back from the people who want to lead us down the route of conflict. Thank you.
Salam alaikum. Guten Abend. And hello to friends and family. After this exposure of Jihadi John, we had yesterday a spokesperson for Cage saying he's a beautiful young man and he was radicalized by the West, effectively. And in the context of this evening's, I'll say the West. And to some extent, I agree. The church is not what it used to be. There has been a moral decline in this country. There has been a departure from the historic Christian faith. And those who hold true to the traditional values, New Testament values and Christian values of this nation are also under oppression. Ofsted goes now into Christian schools with an agenda to secularize them. They do not accept religious faith and religious belief. So when we say the West, there's sometimes a confusion where you see it as Christendom, which historically it has been. But I would propose this evening that it is no longer Christian. Of course, there people say it's multiculturalism. We have to come down to definitions. Since the 1960s, which spawned characters like Jimmy Savile and others who spurned any sense of dignity of women or dignity in relationships, who were encouraged by the BBC only up until very recently and who was being eulogized up until his crimes were exposed, that illustrates that the West is not what it once was. Only 2 years ago, leading politicians were exposed for encouraging the paedophile information exchange. Those leading politicians are still in place. Everyone's saying how terrible Jimmy Savile is, but these leading politicians wanted to encourage young children to be interfered by elders who are in positions of authority. So there has been a serious decline, and there's also been a loss of faith within the church. There's no doubt about it. They will talk about everything other than the foundation documents of the Christian faith. So don't be confused when we talk about the historic Christian faith. Not far from here we have the City of London. On every bollard we have the inscription of the motto. I won't go into the Latin, but it says, "Lord, direct me." This country has a very strong foundation of goodwill and good-natured Christian traditions. Now, of course, in history, there has been what we would call political Christianity, the grabbing for power and territory. But the Lord Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. When he, after the resurrection, he was asked, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He said, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons which the Father has set by his authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses. In other words, there is a spiritual dimension to life. Now that is being eradicated in this modern, secular, and may I say libertarian society in which we live today. And it has left a vacuum in the West, a vacuum of faith and a vacuum of belief and conviction and principle and family values, which I think we share, many of us in this room. So definition is so important. The great reformers, Wilberforce, Shaftesbury, they were driven by Christian convictions, by belief in the Bible. During the Q&A, I would love to explore more of our of the historic roots to where we have come. We may share values, but the Magna Carta, 800th anniversary, was rooted in Christian values, that everyone was under the law of God from above and the 10 Commandments. So there is a tradition which goes right back to the founding of this country, and it is one of tolerance, but also one of faith and tradition. I think I'm out of my 5 minutes, so I look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to our panel. So we now move into the second part of our event tonight. We approximately have around 45 minutes for Q&A. So the way this will be conducted is that if you raise your hand, if you keep your question short and sweet, please, and then basically I'll ask the panel as a whole, if they can, to answer it. But we want to go through as many questions as possible. So if I find there's more hands than necessary, I'll probably take two or three questions at one time.
The future of Islam in the West, I think, centers around the role of politics in Islam and also in the West. Because currently we see that the relationship between the two is centered around violence. And all the acts of mindless violence that we see around the world today are not because of politics and Islam, but it's because of the absence of politics in Islam. So I think if Western policymakers are sincere about ending this cycle of violence, then we need to look at understanding how politics and Islam play a role in the world today, both within Islam itself and also in the relationship with the West. And that's something I'd like the speakers to kind of address in their own way.
Politics is of varying hues. The reality today of the politics of Islam may not be represented in this room, but there's no doubt, we all agree, there's been a resurgence of Islamic belief and a physical acquisition of territory, in the Middle East, which you need to go back many years to find such a similar revival. And I would trace it to the Ayatollah Khomeini. You've mentioned the Salman Rushdie affair, but he was the first Islamic scholar, in my knowledge, who acknowledged the existence of the State of Israel as a judgment of Allah on the intrusion of decadence, Western decadence, which I acknowledge, and Western influence in the Islamic world. And his objective was firstly to purge the Islamic world of compromise, secondly to destroy the great Satan America and their implant, the little Satan Israel. Now that set a fire within Iran, which I would say has been replicated across various traditions of Islam, Shia and Sunni, and we are living out the consequences of it today. Now that, whether or not the division of Dar, al-Islam and Dar al-Harb and al-Gharb, the West, is found in the Quran, and there are experts here to describe it. It is a reality on the ground today that people believe it, and they want to destroy the West. They want to destroy what they see as Western influence in the Islamic world, and the jihadi Johns, who can literally be changed within a short space of time into executioners, is a serious physical threat, I would say, to us all.
Having been a founder member and General Secretary of the Islamic Party of Britain, I have, now defunct, I have always argued that if it's not political, it is not Islamic. Unfortunately, the majority of Muslims in this country threw their weight behind the existing parties, predominantly Labour, for the very reason that they misunderstood politics as power grabbing, and they wanted a share of the pie, not as problem solving. And I don't know if we have yet moved on from that. Talking about international politics, we are being fed this mantra of constitutional democracy here in this country, but actually we have corporate government. We are ruled by an intermarriage of politicians and corporations. They work hand in hand, and traditionally that model of ruling used to be called fascism. And that's what we've got. We just dress it up much nicer than it was in the times of Mussolini or Hitler. Now, violence is politics by other means. You see, if as a corporation you want to plunder the planet or rape the planet, rape is a violent crime. You can't rape somebody and do it nicely. For that you have to have an agreement and get married. So rape is a violent crime, and corporate rape of the resources of the planet is likewise a violent crime. And if those resources happen to be in parts of the world that are, well, of interest to us, we make sure they are either ruled by puppet regimes or we overthrow them. Now, we've seen much evidence of that. I don't need to go into it. Now, I said earlier that it helps to have conflict in order to come in and judge between the warring parties. In my book, Surrendering Islam, and I have brought copies together with some other literatures you can look at and purchase, I have demonstrated that what is known as jihadi or militant Islam, these so-called terrorist movements, have been created purposefully by the other side in order to be able to manipulate the politics of the region. For example, in Syria, we've got ISIS, probably stands for the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service or something like that. We've got ISIS in Syria to allow the Americans to go in a war with Russia against Assad because he's Russian-backed. It's a proxy war. And they couldn't get it through parliament like they did with Iraq, so they need another excuse. In Afghanistan, we have a proxy war with China. World politics is not as naive as people seem to think. And at home, of course, we have the terrorist threat in order to control our own population. So you willingly, because you're scared of your Muslim neighbor, who, by the way, hasn't got access to military-grade weapons, so when these terrorist acts are committed, somebody else is behind it. Your Muslim neighbor, he's scared of it, and so he willingly surrenders all his details. You says, have my data, read my email, watch me on camera, look at my financial dealings, take my money, strip my clothes at the airport. I don't mind because I'm scared of this Muslim and I know my lovely government is keeping me safe. So there is an agenda. And when it comes to politics, I'm coming to a close there, we as Muslims need to understand that power politics is not the politics that we want to play, because we just become like them if we do that. The politics we need to engage in is the politics of speaking up for the people. And I must say this quite clearly, not just speaking up for ourselves, not just speaking up for the Muslims, but speaking up for the people. When Islam gained ground in historic times in different parts of the world, it did so because it was a movement of liberation for the oppressed. And when Islam conquered territory, it did so by the persuasion that Islamic rule was more just than the oppression they suffered. Today, the countries of Europe, of America, and many other countries in the world, but this is where we live, they suffer oppression. They're always 2 months away from homelessness, basically, with the mortgage system and so on and so forth. And we could do something about it by standing up for their rights, but we have utterly failed in that, I have to admit.
Some very interesting points being raised. Again, very quickly, politics in Islam is pivotal, is very centrally important. And again, this is one reason why policymakers, thinkers, academics, media, etc., have always tried to depoliticize Islam. They want to secularize Islam. They want to make the Muslims like the Jews and Christians in terms of being secularly minded. And the Muslims being very stubborn, whether it's in the West or whether, of course, it's in the Muslim world. And of course, we have seen a massive resurgence of Islam happening in the Muslim world. And again, this is one reason why that we've also seen an uptake in terms of the violent conflicts and the wars which have been foisted upon, in particular, the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So we see this trend happening, which the Muslims are riding, but again, other forces are trying to deviate and sidetrack it, and of course, all the while demonizing Islam in the process and Islamic political thoughts at the same time. Tim mentioned, again, a point I have to address, to say that maybe I misunderstand, but the purpose of the resurgence or Islamic revival is not to destroy the West. This is a political struggle. If you look in this sense, in terms of saying is that as a Muslim, which wants to see Islamic solutions, which believes that that was the best way forward in the Muslim world for over centuries, and also believes strongly that that will be reestablished, inshallah, in due course in the Muslim world, that is part of a struggle of ideas, an intellectual struggle. At the moment, as Sahib mentioned, we see corporate fascism, we see multinationals, media, banks, controlling our societies, controlling politicians, controlling everything that we do. And we have to, what is the alternative to that? Yes, there has been historically political struggles of communist, capitalist, Islamic, this is a debate which is only just getting going. So we need to look at it in that particular context. I don't think it was necessarily from Khomeini, although that did have a particular part in it. So I don't think it's just power politics. I think it's actually basically looking after the affairs of the people. This is what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught and actually undertook. He came in a very oppressive society and established a society based on Islamic thoughts and ideas exclusively, and that society flourished. And again, I think this is a way forward for mankind. It doesn't mean you destroy others, but it's an intellectual challenge. What is the strongest thought? Do we want to have secular, liberal, capitalist, fascist, controlled society? in which all of the so-called freedoms and things which people have fought for over centuries has been reined back on the basis of anti-terror laws? Or do we want to see a society which has rules and laws and principles which are enshrined and cannot be changed by the dictate of one politician, one paid politician or another? This is the debate. This is what we need to talk about.
The acts of violence over the past decade or so, which have been associated with Islam, have, I must confess, been spectacular. At the same time, if we take a longer-term comparative view, I well remember the 1970s and 80s when the threat of Irish terrorism in this country was unending and pervasive. And the Irish terrorists had the charming habit of planting bombs in shop toilets and letting them off when they were 10 miles away. Although I deplore those acts of violence associated with Islam, it is difficult to feel contempt for the perpetrators of that violence, because for what it may be worth, at least they generally look their victims in the face and try to justify themselves. They don't skulk around behind hedges or planting bombs in shop toilets. But rather than talk about Islam and violence, which is a subject pretty well done to death, I will complain, I will elaborate on the complaint I made earlier. Almost every Islamic initiative in politics in this country seems to be a demand for restriction. A restriction on the freedom of others to criticize or even to make the most shocking and offensive fun of their faith. Demands sometimes for the shutting down of political parties that are opposed to an Islamic presence in this country. It is all about restriction. It is all about restraint. And yet at the same time, those laws which are brought in, ostensibly with Islamic support, are then used against Muslims. Every time, and obviously I don't agree with what he says, and I don't expect that you will agree with what he says, but he has a point of view. Every time someone like Anjem Choudary opens his mouth in this country, his words are closely scrutinized by a police officer somewhere. And I'm sure that many of your ministers of religion, before they stand up in the mosque to deliver their Friday afternoon sermons, ask themselves, if I say this, will I get into trouble? Will I have to write letters? Will I have to go to the police station? Perhaps I'd better be, perhaps I better not say this. You are subject to an occasional, but an increasingly far-reaching censorship of your opinions. And yet in any debate on freedom of speech in this country, you are on the side of restraint and censorship. Now, you may say, oh, but there is a difference between those people who would mock our most fundamental beliefs, who would just pour scorn on us and legitimate political debate. Well, no, there isn't, because the moment you make any concession to the state on what can and cannot be said, you are drawing a line in sand, and that line will be pushed steadily further and further towards you. The moment you start talking about the infiltration and the shutting down of political parties, then you are giving a green light to people who would infiltrate and shut down your organisations. Many years ago, Nick Griffin of the BNP was secretly filmed saying something perhaps rather unpleasant about Islam. He was prosecuted. He faced 7 years in prison for words uttered had he been found guilty. Now again, I carry no candle for Nick Griffin, but he has a point of view, and it is his undoubted right in my opinion, to speak his mind, just as it is your undoubted right, in my mind, to speak what is in your minds, and it is the undoubted right of men like Anjem Choudhury and any other Islamic cleric to speak what is in his mind. And the only point that I would make tonight is to reiterate that if you want to be left alone by the British state, then you must look beyond your own communities, and you must make it absolutely clear that every right of freedom of speech and association which you demand for yourself, you demand without any discrimination for all other citizens of this country. Anything less than that, and you sound like special pleaders. Anything less than that, and it sounds as if you're calling for a privilege for yourself, but not for anybody else. And that really is all I have to say on Islam and politics.
Okay, next question.
There were two words mentioned in the introduction by Professor Blair, paradigm and honesty, which I wanted to just phrase into a question for the panel. The first one is, maybe there needs to be a basic acknowledgement that Islam and Islamic principles and the principles of liberalism are fundamentally articulating two different paradigms. And I think the failure to acknowledge that perhaps results in each side trying to reflect themselves in the image of the other. So Muslims find themselves pressurized into justifying themselves according to principles which may or may not have foundation in Islam, and vice versa perhaps, okay? And I think if we're going to talk about honesty, I think maybe that's the first step. That maybe some of the trouble that Dr. Gabb's having in terms of a Muslim using free speech to secure a right doesn't always sit that well, because our view on speech is different. We believe in criticism, we believe in honest, direct, robust debate, but there are red lines which may be different from the red lines in the UK or the West as it stands at the moment. And I think this can aggravate how we understand each other. And I'm not going to, I can't claim to have all the answers to everything, even the panel to perhaps to some extent, but maybe that's a starting point. We need to be clear that we're coming from different starting points. Else we're going to demand that Islam be reformed in the image of liberalism. And I think that is not a very useful way forward, because it fundamentally will create tension, frustration, resentment as people see Islam, reformed in another image. And that was just one point. The other point, just very quickly, sorry, I know I've dragged a bit, on honesty, and back to Tim's point about violence. I think there needs to be, again, a more dispassionate, honest discussion about why we find some of these things taking place. And I think people conveniently don't want to talk about foreign policy. They don't want to talk about, as Dr. Gabb talked about, imperialism and the legacy of imperialism, colonization. And people don't want to talk about the role of aggravation and intimidation by security services, etc. They just find it unpalatable to have that discussion. But if we're going to build a constructive way forward, I think we've got to be honest in some of these discussions and be willing to hear things that may not fit our stereotype.
I do not presume for one moment to tell you what your theology should be or how you should conceive your religion. It is not my business. But what I would say in favour of the kind of universal freedom of speech that I advocate is that there's not much you can do to stop it. And as I said, any restraint which is allowed on freedom of speech in this country will be applied to you. Now, I do not think that, I do not particularly admire those cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo. They published the most scurrilous cartoons about Jesus Christ and about my own religion. I do not think that they deserve to be shot, and I rather hope that you would agree that such punishment as may have been due to them was not to be carried out by some paramilitary organisation. But the point is, when those gunmen broke into the office of Charlie Hebdo and shot up those 12 or 14 cultural Marxists, millions of people throughout the world who'd never heard of their magazine and wouldn't have liked if they had seen it, suddenly went out and bought copies. And so, purely as a tactical matter, if you get worked up because somebody is insulting some core aspect of your faith, it may be better to overlook it than to make a big fuss about it. I will repeat, I had never heard of the magazine Charlie Hebdo. I had never heard of any of its journalists, but of course I know about them now. I don't like them very much, but I'm put in the unfortunate position of having to defend their right to say what they want, even though I think that what they said about my faith was scurrilous and most blameworthy. And so, liberalism. There are Islamic libertarians, by the way. Look up the Minaret of Faith website. Libertarianism is by no means alien to certain strands within Islam. Again, I do not presume to lecture you on what you should believe, but I'm just saying that there are Islamic libertarians. Or look at a rather more exotic person. Look at Hassan al-Turabi in Sudan, a man who believes in the right of apostasy from Islam. He doesn't believe that people who stop being Muslims should be killed. He believes in freedom of trade. He believes in freedom of movement. He sounds very like an Islamic classical liberal. Islam is a very large religion, and I think we can all agree that it should not be subject to a monolithic, all-embracing interpretation. There are more liberal conceptions of Islam, and there are less liberal conceptions of Islam. And I leave it to you which one you incline to.
Yes, the questioner raises a very good point, which is simply that Islam is very distinctive and very unique. And you don't need to listen to me to know that. And again, it would be wholly dishonest of Muslims to come from a basis of saying, well, we're living here in the West, it's a secular liberal democracy, therefore we need to be appearing to be that even if we didn't believe in some of its principles. No, we need to be firm and able to stand up and say, we disagree with this. I disagree very fundamentally with Sean, for example, that it's not a question of free speech. Free speech, really, if we look at its history, is about challenging and having political challenge, to challenge political leaders. And we need to exercise that absolutely, whether it's here or in the Muslim world, wherever we're talking about. And there's a distinction between that, and Islam makes a very clear distinction, because Muslims have not raised any concern about the many hundreds and thousands of books in our libraries which are very critical of Islam and very critical of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. That is a debate, and that is a robust debate, and we enjoin that, and we're very happy to be involved in that. Whereas the scurrilous, denigrating, abusive cartoons, bombs and turbans, and naked depictions and sexual acts, which the Charlie Hebdo's and this like, is all about demonization and denigrating and insulting the person that is dearer to a Muslim than anything else in life. So that is a provocation. It is not a debate. It's not a political debate. It's not about getting Muslims to open up. It's actually about attacking a core pillar of their belief. And that has got nothing to do with free speech. That's all about insult. So the key for us is also, as the questioner raised, is to start looking at topics, again, as some of the panel members have said, which is, terrorism. Yes, of course, you have a greater likelihood of dying in your bathtub than you do from an act of terror, whether it's Britain, America, or anywhere else in the world. Yet that dominates the political discourse because it is used as a stick to hit the Muslims with, and is used as a stick to hit the wider society to say, we are going to cut down on your actual freedoms, your political rights. We're going to lead towards totalitarian-oriented states in the name of suppressing Islam, but also in the name of suppressing a wider population which might show sympathy with anything which is against what we believe in as the ruling classes. State violence, of course, is a very good example in that it seems to be a no-no topic. You are a justifier, you are justifying terrorism if you want to divert into discussions of foreign policy or state-induced terrorism. Therefore, the whole topic is shut down, as indeed it was yesterday, or attempted to be shut down over the question of Muhammad and Wiley about in terms of what the security services had been doing to him. So yes, let's open our eyes and ears and actually see what's going on and get involved in this particular debate.
Coming back to the original question, I do think that different paradigms, potentially non-compatible paradigms, are at play. And the denial of that leads to a dishonesty in the discussion, or at least a confusion. Let me spell this out. If, Sean, you argued your case as an anarchist, I'd say, okay, I can take that. But you argue as a secular libertarian, or humanist, or in anarchism, there is no rules. Everybody does as he pleases, and we see where it turns out. But this is not what you argue for. Democracy, secular democracy, tries to present itself as the scientific model of arranging human affairs, but behaves as fanatical as any religion when it comes to defending what they believe in and denying other people an opposing view. So you make your own man-made constitution sacred that may not be violated or changed. You have particular laws that you've made up and have changed over history that may not be criticized. And then you cannot handle when Islam as a religion takes you on your own field and argues as an ideology. Because Islam is also an ideology. It is a divine-inspired, religious-based ideology. And that is what you can't handle. You want Islam to just be a religion, a private devotion. But Islam says we demand to enter into politics, to enter into economics. And by the way, libertarian objection to religion had to do with opening up the way for the usurer to charge interest, which all religions forbade. But that's a different story. So when it comes to honesty, I think also it demands courage. The courage to actually admit where we're coming from. We have no problems as Muslims to tell you that we believe that there are limits, that the divine law is above the human law, that what you call human rights is actually something we've had long before as divine rights for human dignity. That what you call the Magna Carta, which some king gave begrudgingly to people when he couldn't sustain his power over them anymore and needed their support, we've had it 1500 years ago in Surah At-Tawbah and the Contract of Medina, a written constitution. Islam is no stranger to politics, economics, and regulating the affairs of man, but in a way that is divinely inspired and above this hodgepodge making rules that the West has partly done in opposing the rule of the church. And yes, there were, as Tim said, also excesses by the church, but you threw the baby out with the bathwater. This kind of, 20 years ago it was a crime to be homosexual. Today it's almost mandatory, but it's a crime to be a pedophile. Who defines these things? In the Vatican, the age of majority was, until a year or two ago, 13. So you could not be a pedophile if somebody was above 14. But here, of course, it's 18. But then most young people have sex well before 18, so they're all pedophiles. We live in a nation of pedophiles. Who makes these fantastic rules that don't add up and then wants to hold everybody to it? Of course you have limits. Of course you have boundaries. Of course you tell people you can do this and you can't do that. But what do you base it on? The whim of, we feel this might be good. We think this is nice. Scientific evidence, mostly it's theories. No, we just come to the conclusion that we try this experiment or we try that way. But this is not the way to actually, what has it landed us with? This last century was the one with the greatest loss of life, the most devastating wars. It was the most, shall we say, satanic century in human history. It was a disaster for the planet. The planet is dying. The resources are being depleted. Secular democracy, libertarianism. Well, maybe it's time to go back to the manual. If all else fails, read the manual. Maybe it's time to go back to scripture. Maybe it's time to go back to religion and read the book. And we have the courage to say that. But if you want an honest debate, maybe you should put your cards on the table. Because no, it's not like there is no limits. You're not an anarchist. You want us not to be engaged with you on an ideological level. You want us just to play in our corner and give you a free playing field for everything else.
I would enjoy very much having more discussion with you. We have a lot in common. I think one of the memorable statements of Cameron after Charlie Hebdo was saying that he stood for the values of democracy. Democracy is not a value; it's a vehicle for values. And there's a big push now in terms of British values because they've abandoned the identity of this country. They're trying to replace it with a new identity that they haven't really thought through. And in terms of religion and ideologies, there's no doubt that the new alternative lifestyle movement is an ideology. It's almost a cult. You enter, there's an initiation ceremony, you come out, you're in it, you can't say anything against it. It is an ideology. And I think, the political correctness in itself is an ideology. The classic, historic Christian position is not one of values. It's one of absolutes. It's one of standards, exactly as you would interpret that they come down from the Creator, the one to whom we are accountable to. He created us. Now, we might differ on the nature of God and the nature of his revelation, and elements of theology, but the fundamental point that we are created, we agree on. The Christian position is that God is personal, so we are personally accountable to God for our behavior. The Ten Commandments, written in the Hebrew Scriptures, from which the whole Christian writings, incidentally, all of whom were Jewish, and there's some uncertainty about Luke. So we're talking about the Jewish scriptures, upon which, of course, the tradition of Islam has been, as I would interpret, built. The question was about paradigms. It's absolutely right. Now, Bill Clinton and his gang started the peace process, so-called, and the Oslo process, and it was a complete failure. And Madeleine Albright, who was part of that process, wrote a book following entitled The Mighty, i.e. the Americans, and the Almighty, and acknowledged the failure of the peace process was the inability to address the religious dimension. The religious track was ignored completely. And modern Western diplomacy, secular humanistic diplomacy, is duplicitous. It's not honest, fundamentally. I've been in meetings where on both sides in the Israel-Palestine dispute, where the intermediaries are basically rubbishing the other side and agreeing with the people who are in the room with them, and then go to the other side and do exactly the same. It's completely dishonest. But on the Christian Islam axis, I would say that the Christian approach to the scriptures and both what we call the Old and the New, the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek, has a very robust tradition of openness, of free transmission of the scriptures. There are 20,000 plus manuscripts which can be compared one to another so that you can establish, and they are now being digitized, the whole Greek New Testament, so you can actually establish where the differences have come through translation and transcription. But if you only have one version, you've got no way to check whether the person, I know this is getting into detail, that the person who said, right, this is the Quran, this is the only one, you have to trust the person who delivered that final version. Whether I think there is a more robust and honest tradition in the scriptures. And I've had a lot of conversations with Muslim friends in the Middle East, and asking them why don't you, what do you think of the Christian Bible? And one of the complaints is they say, well, you dishonor the prophets. Why do you show Abraham and his failures? Why do you show David and his failures? And in the context of the question, I answered back and said, because it's true. It's an authentic narrative of these people who were created in God's image, were created good, Adam and Eve, but there was a fall and that image was marred. Now, this is the Christian teaching, that every life has value because it's created by a personal God with dignity, imago Dei. I know it's not accepted within Islam, but man is created in God's image. So there is an intrinsic value to all human life. But because of the enemy of God, and this is also not spoken about much in the pulpit today or across the churches, there is an enemy of God. We've mentioned the satanic verses, we've mentioned Satan, we've mentioned the satanic century, and I totally agree with that. There's a spiritual dimension where the enemy of God, Jesus depicted him as the enemy of the farmer who planted good seeds. He planted weeds and tares. He wanted to destroy the good seeds. But God, in his patience and his grace, waits for both. He doesn't want to harm the good seeds by cutting out the bad. So the tragedy of human history is a testimony to God's patience, and he's waited for the good seeds to grow, and then he said there will be the judgment, there will be the harvest, where the weeds are separated from the tares. This is how I can come to terms with people like Hitler and Stalin and their wickedness, because they will be judged. Even if they slept in their beds when they died, there is a judgment to come. And that is the Christian message, and I totally agree that we should. And there are incompatibilities, and we just have to be real. Dialogue, it doesn't mean that you come to the lowest common denominator. So much more to talk about, but thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, so I'll just take it over there.
Hello there. My name is Mark. I'm born again Christian. Been born again 17 years. I'm one of London's famous black cab drivers, and so I see life in all its fullness. I see terrorist attacks. I see marches. I see demonstrations. I see political demonstrations, and I hear all views of all people. And I've sat there for 20 years listening to this. The one thing that sticks out about Islam is that I've heard it twice tonight, that there's provocation. Okay, there's certain lines of provocation, and there should be red lines drawn in the sand about when Islam or anyone is provoked. Muslims around the world seem to be the most easily provoked people on the planet. Provocation is only yours if you accept it to be yours. The Lord Jesus Christ is the most reviled and humiliated and person of such great atrocious attacks by the secular liberal media in this country and all over the world. But I never, ever take offence. You know why? Because the God of the Bible says that they're accountable to him and he will take vengeance. I want to ask the panel, why is there so much stock on blasphemy in Islam? Because in my book, it's blasphemous as Muslims to demote the Lord Jesus Christ down to a level of prophet and prophet only. That is blasphemous. That is total blasphemous and a total denial of who Jesus himself said he was in Holy Scripture. I never get offended. I don't take up arms. I don't even complain. I sit there and smile and ask the Lord to forgive you, and he will deal with you in his own way. I believe there should be no red lines in any sand when it comes to assessing other people's beliefs. You can say what you want about Christians, the seculars, the atheists. Their attack is vehement. But I still say, let them say what they want, Muslims say what they want, and let Christians say what they want. I believe there should be no red lines whatsoever. Why are Muslims so easily provoked?
Well, the easy answer is because those that are provoked are not prepared to assimilate, and not prepared to compromise. And no doubt the Islamic scholars here can point to the verses which say that you must respond, but people respond in different ways. And I'll come to my first point from the talk, and that is that whatever we might be saying in a nice dialogue forum here, there are violent, very violent men. They may be in small numbers. They were in small numbers in the days of Nazi Germany, but they took power and they inflicted terrible suffering on others. So the issue is how we collectively, not with a wishy-washy Western compromise and duplicity and dishonesty, how do we, people who believe in the preservation of life, the dignity of life, the right for people to have, as it says in the scriptures, somewhere to sit under their own fig tree, to have some land to live on, and dignity for their own life. How do we deal with the men of violence in a way that doesn't make the whole situation much worse? Because you could not hold this dialogue forum in any of the ISIL areas or other areas, as we know, where the intolerance has come through. There are roots which are, I would suggest, not necessarily Islamic to these to these groups. There was a terrible cloud of inhumanity that infected probably all religions in the last century, but it was rooted in atheism, and that is salutary for us all. But we have to look now, how do we bring dignity back to human life? And I would say it does come back to faith and to belief in personal accountability. And what we had and we've bequeathed, I believe, from the Christian scriptures to this country, which has now been discarded. So I'm not suggesting that we're a Christian nation, as David Cameron, in my view, cynically suggested at the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, and then went on to ram through legislation which was very anti-Christian and totally anti-democratic when there were 600,000 signatures against the gay marriage proposals. I'm not suggesting that, but I think that we have to say, what is our faith? What are the core issues? We can dialogue together, but to take up arms against people in a room is not right. But then there is just war theory, where if the evil is spreading, if it's actually encroaching on others, if it's coming to the threshold of my own home, then we have to deal with it in a strong way, notwithstanding what you've said about the state and colonialism and all the rest of it. I do need to say, because I know folks here have written about it and they've said about it this evening. I thought I'd lost my sound. In terms of Israel, it is a liberal democracy, but it is a Jewish democracy. There are a million plus Arabs who choose and enjoy a freedom that they don't have in other countries in the region. And I've heard Muslims, proud British-born Muslims over here. You might that might remind you of a quote from one who say, if they were to choose anywhere in the Middle East they would like to live, it would be in Israel.